football's first cult hero. He was like a morbidly obese goalkeeper. There's stories about him like throwing opposition attackers into his own goal net.
We are joined by AFC Finners, aka Finley. How are we doing, mate?
Very good, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
It is a pleasure, mate. And today you are going to be talking us through the FA Cup history. Now, this is a feature that we're going to be running once a month, where we focus on a part of English football history. And because Tommy has been so intrigued as to why the FA Cup is so important in the UK and why it has so much history, we thought we'd start off here. So, Tommy, are you ready to talk FA Cup?
Yeah, I'm ready to talk FA Cup with an expert like AFC Finners. He's got a channel on YouTube. It was Rory again. It's Rory who finds the cool people on Twitter and YouTube. So before we start, Finley, do you want to tell us a little bit about your project, how people can find your videos on YouTube, and how to find you on other social media as well?
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, also the channel is called AFC Finners, and you can find me on YouTube. For the most part, we're focused on like sort of somewhat obscure areas of football history. Sometimes do big deals as well, but it's kind of about telling cool stories from the history of the beautiful game. A little bit like you will have seen on TIFO or HITC sevens, but like we've got like a series of topics for like in terms of Italian football. I've covered Grande Torino, Nerio Rocco, but there's all kinds of different topics that I've covered as well as that, like Dixie Dean. The 1978 World Cup, probably the most controversial World Cup of all time. And I also do ground hopping videos from time to time. So I've got 2 up at the moment, including one when I went to Portsmouth versus Shrewsbury last week. I've got 2 that I'm currently working on. And yeah, I've got nearly 60 videos out now. I only started back in March. But yeah, it's all kinds of different areas of football history, people you may or may not have heard about. But yeah, we just cover every area of football history we can. We're trying to like tell stories that people may not have heard of, so that footballing legends that get the credit they deserve can have their names enshrined in history permanently.
Nice.
Nice. It sounds...
Yeah.
Oh, go on.
So I was just going to say, also, yeah, so you can find me on Twitter and Instagram. It is just AFC Finners. If you just search, you'll be able to find them there. But yeah, just search AFC Finners, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. You'll be able to find me easily. So I just forgot to add that on the end.
It's all right. Beautiful. That sounds right up our street. I think we have done a few kind of documentary type things in our first series. I don't know about you, Tommy, but I really enjoyed them. So I think we're excited to kind of do a bit more of it this year. So are we ready to go? Let's do FA Cup history.
I'm ready to roll. So this was pretty fun because when we had our first talk and we kind of talked about the possibility of having like a regular feature on the show, we could cover different areas of English history or general football history with Finlay. It kind of came natural to start with the FA Cup. So I'm going to ask you right off the bat, Finlay, why is the FA Cup the first thing that came to our mind? Why is every football fan aware of the history of this cup and of how much importance it has in English football?
Okay, so basically, I think in a lot of the top European leagues, the kind of domestic cup competitions like the Coppa Italia, DFB Pokal, Coppa del Rey certainly do matter if teams win them. But I think there's something special about winning the FA Cup. And I think a big part of it comes from the fact it is the oldest cup competition in the world. So it was founded in 1871 before any other cup competition. So it was kind of the cup that like created football as we know it. And like the phrase, the magic of the FA Cup, it is very cliche, but at the same time, it is very true. There's just like the FA Cup has just generated so many amazing stories that we'll be able to cover. And like underdog stories and kind of romantic runs, and like the story, the political stories behind it as well, in terms of how it was founded and how like it led to the dawn of professionalism in football, are just really interesting. And I don't think there's a tournament other than perhaps the World Cup that's had such a huge impact on football as we know it. Even the Champions League, it certainly has changed football a lot. But I think it was the FA Cup that really turned football from just a game that people play for the fun of it into the institution that we know.
And just to give a little bit of context, because when we think about 1871, none of us were alive. None of you listeners were alive, most likely. And if you are, congratulations for making it this far. But just to give a little bit of context, so in 1870, 1871, the Franco-Prussian War was underway. Countries like Ireland and Poland didn't really exist. They were under, respectively, the former United Kingdom of England and Ireland, and Poland were under the Russian Empire. The vast majority of the Balkan Peninsula was occupied by the Ottoman Empire, and Italy had been an independent country for 2 years only, and Rome would be appointed capital on July 1st that year. Talking about events, specific events, we have a few sporting ones. On March 27th, 1871, the first Rugby Union International resulted in a 1-0 win by Scotland over England. On May 4th, for our American listeners, the first supposedly Major League Baseball game took place in the United States. Trade unions were also legalized in the United Kingdom by the Trade Union Act of 1871. And funnily enough, the first cat exhibition was held at the Crystal Palace of London. But talking about inventions, for maybe the biggest one of that year was Antonio Meucci patenting the teletrofono, which was an ancient version of the telephone. So this was a little bit the state of the world, but there was also another big thing that was taking over many different countries, including England, which was the railway system, which in a way allowed the FA Cup to start and actually take the shape that we know now. So, Finlay and Rory, from this moment on, I'm going to be a listener. I'm going to just bask in you two bombing me with information about this beautiful competition. And Finlay, I will let you start from wherever you want.
Yeah, so in line with what Tommy said, the invention of the railway was a huge part of the development of the FA Cup, because basically it was 1863 that the FA was officially founded. Sheffield FC were the first professional club. And so for those first 8 years, teams would just tend to play friendlies against each other. There wouldn't be huge amounts of prize money. And then, but obviously over the years, it kind of became essentially an eternal pre-season. Like, friendlies are all well and good, but it's kind of, once the game is wrapped up and done, it has no consequence. There was like no prize money on offer, and there wasn't much incentive other than a bit of pride. But then, like, with the invention of the railway, like, say a team in Newcastle playing a team in Southampton, obviously it's hard enough nowadays getting the train up and down there, but imagine having to go there in horse-drawn carriage or whatever, or maybe even boat. It would have been a nightmare. But then with the invention of railways, it's a lot easier to do something like that. And the secretary of the FA, named Charles Alcock, remembered when he was at Harrow, for non-English listeners, that's a posh public school. They basically used to play like sort of knockout cup competitions amongst that school, and he kind of said, maybe we could have something like this for English football, because he noticed, like, now that teams could go further distances to play each other, there was an opportunity to give them sort of a guarantee of fixtures and like give them something to play for. So the FA Cup first take place in 1871, and basically it wasn't actually that popular at first, because like, on my notes, it was, at the time there were 50 members of the FA. Invites were sent to all of them to take part, but only 15 would respond, and then 3 more teams withdrew before the tournament even began. But then it was Wanderers against Royal Engineers in the first FA Cup final, and Charles Alcock, the man who proposed the idea of the FA Cup, was the captain of Wanderers, who would win.
Now, the original teams, they were majority made up of private schools, as you mentioned. When was it that the working classes started to come into the game? Because I think there was an image of the game where it was middle class, and then it suddenly kind of changed to working class. When and how did that happen?
So basically, the first significant step in that was when Blackburn Rovers reached the final in 1882, because they were the first like team that weren't like related to anything like that, like reaching a final. but they had also, but basically there was another team in Blackburn called Blackburn Olympic. But the thing is, with like all these public school teams, they all worked as like lawyers or bankers or very well-paid jobs, and so they could easily go from London to another city to play a game and not have to worry about losing out. But like teams like Blackburn Olympic all worked in factories, so if they had to take a day out of work to go and play a football game, they would lose a lot of money. And like if yeah,
and I think it's extremely fitting that the Trade Union Act happened exactly in 1871. I don't think it went as far as justifying workers for taking a day off to miss football, but at least there was starting to be a sort of conscience around the right of workers, and especially in a country like England, for the factory workers, I think.
Oh, definitely. Well, it's if anybody's seen the Netflix series The English Game, it really symbolizes the whole thing at the time. Like, it is about this kind of era. Some of the facts are taken and sort of given artistic license, alternated slightly, but in a nutshell, all these people playing for teams like Anglo-Italians didn't understand the lives of the factory workers. But then Arthur Kinnaird, he kind of develops and realizes what they have to go through. But then it was but then Blackburn Olympic, they had all these factory and mill workers, but a lot of them seemed to be maybe paid under a table, because at the time you weren't legally allowed to get paid for playing football because it was an amateur game. At Blackburn Olympic, they were able to reach the final, and they had a coach called Jack Hunter, who was a former England international, and he took them on to Blackpool for training for a week before the final, and then they faced Old Etonians and won 2-1, and they were the first non-public school side to win the FA Cup. And like, it was the first Northern team against all the odds, and that was the end of the elitist domination of the FA Cup. But then after they won it, a lot of the players went across the road to join Blackburn Rovers. And again, they had a player called Fergus Suter, who is the main character of the TV series called The English Game. And he stopped working as a stonemason when he joined a side called Darwin. And then he joined Blackburn Rovers in 1880. And many believe that was because he was being offered wages by Blackburn Rovers.
Now, this is a key thing that you're raising, that the FA Cup really did kind of speed up or kind of encourage the process of the professionalization of the game, and that is obviously a key moment in the history of football. But there's a name that you mentioned there that I wanted to kind of highlight a little bit. I find him quite interesting, is Arthur Kinnaird. Okay, so he won the FA Cup 5 times and appeared in 9 finals. How key was this guy to the FA Cup and to the professionalization of the game?
Yeah, well, I think he was like a key early symbol for the FA Cup, because he but again, it's like, I don't entirely know how accurate it is, but like, he did like in the English Game, you do see that he kind of understands the plight that people like Fergus Suter were going through. But after he retired from football, he would become president of the FA for 33 years. And a bit of trivia, he won the FA Cup so many times that he was actually recognised. He received recognition for what he did by actually being given the first FA Cup trophy. So in 1911, the second FA Cup trophy they had, which replaced the first one that was stolen from a shop window. We could come back to that if you want. Basically, due to his so in 1911, due to his services to football, Arthur Kinnaird was presented the FA Cup trophy, and he was allowed to keep it. And that FA Cup trophy was replaced by the famous one that we know now.
Very nice. Well, getting his own FA Cup trophy. And obviously the guy was key, as you said, in the formation of professional football. But another thing that the FA Cup is really famous for, of course, is, and you mentioned it, the magic of the cup. And even back in the beginning, we had one of the first upsets. Now, I know you wanted to talk about one of them in particular, but what was the kind of headline upset in the FA Cup around this period?
Okay, so one of the first major ones was the Notts County, when they won the FA Cup, because they won it as a 3rd division side, and that was in 1894. They beat Bolton Wanderers in the final. One of their players got a hat trick, and like that was kind of after it had really opened up, because after that Blackburn Olympic victory, mentions, like loads of teams started to get their name on the trophy. So Aston Villa, West Brom, Preston North End, all won the trophy for the first time in the 1880s, and then it was Notts County won as the third division side, which proved there could be big cup shocks. And then 7 years later, Tottenham Hotspur, who at the time were a non-league team, were able to win the FA Cup in 1901, which is probably the
last trophy they've won.
It's strange. It's strange that they can win a trophy as a non-league team, but then in the Premier League spending hundreds of millions. So, I'm sure Rory's loving this.
That's how life goes, I guess.
But yeah, those were like the first initial shocks, but I think they really coincided with the dawn of professionalism because players were able to because players who had talent but also had to combine their lives with work. It didn't have to be they based their lives around the factories anymore. They could focus on the game. But going back to the professionalism, the really significant thing that happened around the mid 1880s, basically in 1884, Preston knocked out a London-based side called Upton Park. No relation to West Ham, but that's where they were based. And Upton Park basically complained, saying that Preston players are being paid, so they almost had been cheated. And then a lot of clubs joined in their anger, and over 30 of them said, right, we're going to make our own FA where we can be paid to play football. And then eventually the FA said, all right, we'll let you be paid. It's kind of it's a little bit like what happened in rugby if they found a solution that worked for everyone. But because there could have been easily a case of a different form of football existed, like there's rugby league and rugby union, but thankfully they sorted it out and we have football as we know it. But if those sides had gone and made their own FA, heaven knows what football would be like today.
Okay, so you mentioned again that the FA Cup wasn't always that popular. When was the moment when it became hugely popular? Now, I think for me, when I was researching, the first final at Wembley seemed like a real kind of turning point for the Cup. Had it always been popular, or was that the moment it really took off?
That was certainly a watershed moment, but I wouldn't say the FA Cup didn't have a lot of popularity before then, because you have to think that was the showpiece event of that was the World Cup final back then, because there wasn't anything that even came close. It was either FA Cup or friendlies. They often before then the FA Cup final was hosted in not Selhurst Park, but a stadium called Crystal Palace. I think it's arena. I can't remember. It's Suffolk, but basically it's just like an athletics ground in Crystal Palace, and that's where all the finals used to be played. But when it was that 1923 FA Cup final, one of the reasons they did build Wembley was for that, because they knew what a big occasion that was in the footballing calendar, and they thought it was fitting of a better stadium. But obviously that was the famous White Horse final, and in typical FA fashion, they didn't plan it out properly at all. But it ended up being one of the most famous FA Cup finals in history.
Why did it become one of the most famous ones?
So basically what happened is that was the first, like I said, the first ever FA Cup final to be hosted at Wembley. It was between Bolton and West Ham. And the FA said, we're not going to do tickets because we got more than enough space to get everyone in. And they didn't have more than enough space to get everyone in, because basically people turned up in their droves because they wanted to see the first ever FA Cup final at the new Wembley. And it's estimated anywhere between 200 and 300,000 people turned up. And then they poured out onto the pitch, and it looked like the game wasn't going to go ahead. But there's an iconic image of a policeman riding in on the white horse, dispersing the crowd. And they eventually managed to push them to the side of the pitch. And ever since, it's been known as the White Horse Final, because of the police officer called George Scory riding out on Billy the White Horse. And but it's that kind of shows how popular it was, that many people were so desperate to get in.
Do you think that's the moment that sort of marked the the beginning of football as we know it? Is that the moment where England kind of realized that there was so much following behind the sport?
Yeah, I certainly think that could be the case, because you also have to think that was 1923. A nation was still licking its wounds from the First World War, and I think it was only about 5 or so years after it had been stopped. So many people have lost loved ones. So many people have been traumatized by what they see. What they had seen. So just having an event like that, it was just escapism, and that's what football has been so often for people. And I think, yeah, I certainly agree with what you say. Like it was a kind of watershed moment in showing just how popular football was. Because again, at the Euros final this year, we had a capacity, but there were fans breaking in to stadium, like getting past stewards, like at Wembley again, like almost 100 years later. So kind of shows, like, you see what I mean. There's parallels even within 100 years of just how much people want to see a big event at Wembley like that.
Yeah, definitely. Rory, you had a question, I believe.
And there was one more person that you wanted to talk about within the FA Cup. He's quite a historical character. Who is he? And
Yes.
what was his story?
Yeah, so it's William Folk. He was a goalkeeper for Sheffield United and Chelsea. Some people might have heard of him. There is a section about him in whole histories, but in a nutshell, he was kind of football's first cult hero. He was like a morbidly obese goalkeeper. There's stories about him like throwing opposition attackers into his own goal net. But in one FA Cup final, there was a truly bizarre incident where Sheffield United played Southampton, and Southampton scored a goal that meant the game went to a replay. And William Folk felt that the goal shouldn't have been allowed. So after the game, he went unclothed and chased the referee, complaining about the decision. And the referee had to hide in the locker before, and whilst William Folk was outside, and people had to tear him away before he took the door off the locker by his hinges. Thankfully, Sheffield United won the replay. Heaven knows what would have happened if Southampton won.
This is an incredible story. When you said he was known to do something to the opposition players, I thought something like throwing sandwiches at them, but no, instead he just threw them inside the goal.
He
That's
certainly
incredible.
wouldn't waste a sandwich.
Yeah. I feel like a few years back there was a similar character in maybe in an FA Cup game that was eating a sandwich on the bench.
Yeah, that was I've forgotten his name, but yeah, it was Sutton's goalkeeper, and basically, I think the very controversial Sun newspaper had like odds of him eating a pie. Wayne Shaw, that was his name. They put odds on him eating a pie during the game, and then he was seen eating a pie during the game, and then it turned out he'd been prompted to do that by the bookies and had to actually quit his job.
Yeah.
So it was a very bizarre story, but I'd expect nothing less from the Sun.
Yeah, exactly. But so is that maybe that's also one of the reasons why the FA Cup has got so much following, because like these bizarre events could also take place with so many teams involved. But how come that after reaching its peak, we could say, the FA Cup started losing a little bit of following, and there was a period when it kind of went down, and recently it has gained the same interest that it had before? Why do you think that happened?
I think the obvious answer is the rise of the Champions League. Like when it changed in 1992, there was. I mean, it's difficult to pinpoint when exactly it, because you sort of like, because you can obviously see in the League Cup like how teams put up their weaker sides. But I guess it was maybe like late 2000s and stuff, because you could see in the 1990s like it was still dominated by the top teams, Man United, Arsenal, and Chelsea, and it still was in the 2000s. But you felt like you kind of like when teams would go out the FA Cup in the late 90s and early 2000s, you would feel like they would go in the dressing rooms and feel like it was the end of the world. But like when that happens, maybe towards the late 2000s, they could still think, well, it's okay. We still got the Premier League and FA Cup. But I think it's kind of a double-edged thing, because there is that aspect of, you look at Arteta, you think people will look at the FA Cup and think, well, if we win that, it can keep me in a job. But then you look at the other side, Louis van Gaal, he won the FA Cup and still got sacked. So it's kind of, but I certainly think in recent years, I think it's regained a lot of that magic. I think the Leicester thing has really shown that, because that like that was just like incredible, that final, just the whole build up, just constantly mentioning how, you know, they'd lost 4 finals and never won it. It just felt like destiny. I feel like the whole story of Wigan as well, like really showed how magical it could be. But it's just like I think a lot of it is the case of like the early rounds as well, because you get like if you remember like Lincoln City's run to the quarterfinals a few years ago. But I think to like lower league fans as well, like I remember it was in 11-12, like Cheltenham, my local side, reached the FA Cup third round. I remember being sat in front of the telly and it was like, who are we going to get? Who are we going to get? And then Tottenham Hotspur away. So we got to go to White Hart Lane and got to see, you know, Harry Redknapp. And like sadly Gareth Bale wasn't playing for Tottenham that day, but you know, we got to do an away day to White Hart Lane. They lost 3-0. But it's just little things like that. It's just like pinning up the lower league teams against the Premier League teams. And I think maybe for a long time the magic kind of went down to the lower leagues. And even though nobody from the lower leagues won the FA Cup, there was certainly that appreciation. But yeah, it's like I feel like in maybe the past couple of years, the interest in it has certainly come back, but it's difficult to sort of see the pinpoint moment where that would have happened. Maybe it was Arsenal's comeback against Hull, just because that was like probably the most dramatic FA Cup final we'd seen in such a long time.
So exactly, talking, you just gave me a great leeway to talk about this. What are the biggest upsets? We selected a bunch of good ones, but if we had to pinpoint 3 big upsets in FA Cup history, which ones would you pick, Finn?
So I would say I think the one we mentioned about Tottenham, like you know, a non-league side winning the FA Cup, that is just pure insanity. No matter how different the game was back then, that is just madness. I think the one I just mentioned as well with Wigan, like they were a side that, you know, a few days after winning the FA Cup, got relegated, and they were like facing prime Mancini Man City. And yet in the final, they absolutely dominated Man City. Callum McManaman turned into Cristiano Ronaldo. And I just don't, it was just such an unlikely result. And it was just so romantic, so beautiful. And it was like, again, they got relegated a couple of days later. And it was like, well, who cares? They'll always have that FA Cup to boast about. Because people said, like, I remember on like the radio, they would always say, would you rather stay up or win the FA Cup? But it's like, at the end of the day, Wigan are in like League One now, but they can always say, they won that FA Cup. If they stayed up, they might have just got relegated next season. So you see what I mean? And I think in terms of the third, I think there's another one we mentioned is 1973 between Sunderland and Leeds. Leeds had won the FA Cup for the first time the year before, and I think they just won the league title again. So looking to do a double. I need to double check that. But then like Sunderland were a second division side, and there's actually a famous clip where Brian Clough and Bobby Charlton are doing punditry before the game. And Brian Clough basically says there is absolutely no chance that Leeds will not win this game. Bearing in mind his contempt for Leeds, that was quite a strong thing for him to say. But then Bobby Charlton said, I don't know, Brian, I think Sunderland have a chance. And then Sunderland won 1-0, and their goalkeeper, Jimmy Montgomery, made the best double save you'll probably ever see.
Yeah, I will have to look that up. But besides these standard games, it wouldn't be football without Arsenal blowing it. And we actually have 2 games lost by Arsenal in the final. One in the 1932-1933 season, 2-0 loss against Walsall in the 3rd division of the northern section, which just sounds like very, very low. And then also in 1991, 1992, Arsenal lost their final to Wrexham 2-1 with goals by Mikey Thomas and Steve Watkin. More recently, we had the Shrewsbury beat Everton 2-1 in the 2002-2003 season. And I guess these are some of the biggest ones. Even Wigan beating Man City in 2012 2013, as you just mentioned. So quite a few upsets in the final. So it's a tournament that really like pushes people's expectations until the end. But one last question I wanted to ask you: why do you think the FA Cup is so popular in England, while in Italy, Coppa Italia is the opportunity to make your second string keeper get a breath of fresh air on the pitch?
Okay, so I'm glad you asked that question, because there's a lot of different reasons. But I think well, I think there's the obvious aspect that the FA Cup is the oldest tournament we know, so it's got so much more history. But I think in terms of the way it's set up, it's very straightforward. Like teams, so say you're a non-league team, you go for the qualifiers, and then you're in the first round. You could beat a League Two team, then you're up against a famous Championship team. It's just the way it's set up means there will be those giant cup draws. Like you can get something like Man City playing Cheltenham in the FA Cup this season, or Marine against Tottenham. But the way the Coppa Italia is set up, I have looked this up, and it's like, am I right in saying that the top teams will enter in the round of 16, won't they?
Yep, they do.
Yeah, which is a very late stage for a team to enter a tournament. But then kind of all the lower league Italian teams kind of eat each other before then. And at the very best, like say there's a fourth division Italian team, they'll get to, let's just say they get to round of 16 and they beat Juventus 1-0 at home. They still have to travel to Turin for that second leg.
Yeah, true.
Yeah,
true.
It's just, even if you do get that giant match, a giant killing is so unlikely, because realistically, that kind of level of giant killing is a one-off. You're not going to be able to pull it off over 2 legs. And I think like there's also the Coppa Italia, like just hasn't like had the opportunity to make that much history as well, because it was founded a lot later than the FA Cup, but also because of the Second World War, it was on hiatus until am I right in thinking 1958 or somewhere around then?
Probably, yeah.
It was on hiatus for so long. So all these teams, so like if you got 14, 15 years where it doesn't exist, that's 14, 15 years worth of stories you just don't have. And like, because you look at like how many times like someone like a team like AC Milan only winning it 5 times is like that's criminal. But it's because they didn't like it wasn't there for them to win for so long. But I think it's just a combination of factors. But I think the main reasons are the FA Cup just has generated more stories because it's been around for longer, but also these giants, these David versus Goliath fixtures happen with so much more ease. Whereas in Italy, it does seem like it's very much a formality, and like it almost is like set up like a Super Cup rather than a straight up knockout. So,
yeah, I agree with you. No, and the thing is that you said it right. You might also meet, so a lower league team in England might meet Manchester City in the week that they've played a Premier League game and maybe a Champions League game. And so in Italian, they would talk about fixture congestion. But in my opinion, if, let's say, Walsall play Manchester City, it's only fair that they have the advantage of playing less games. And so it makes the magic possible. And I agree with you. Alessandria had an incredible run a few years ago. They did get a point, I believe, against AC Milan, but then they couldn't overturn the second leg. So, yeah, I agree with you. FA Cup definitely gives more room for magic to happen. Rory, is there anything that you would like to add before we say goodbye to our good friend Finn?
I just feel I need to stick up for Arsenal. We are the record winners of this competition.
I knew you'd say that.
Yeah, but within that does mean I think I was looking through the upsets, and I think we have been a victim of the most giant killings as well. So, you win some, you lose some. We lost to York as well, Wrexham, Walsall. So we've done it a few times. We are quite good at shooting ourselves in the foot. But no, I think that's it. That was great. I really enjoyed that history lesson, and hearing that the history of the FA Cup is always fascinating. So thank you, Finley, for coming on. Tommy, anything else you want to ask before we finish?
No, Finn, weren't you at an FA Cup game this very week?
No.
The
FA Cup is in very early rounds at the moment, so it's like non-league teams. Oh no, right. I was at the League Cup.
Oh, right. You were
actually,
in the League Cup.
Yeah, something that is going to make you very jealous. I have actually had the fortune of going to 2 FA Cup finals because, in a
Wow.
nutshell, I had a family member who worked for a charity that was closely affiliated with the FA, and as a result, he got tickets for matches at Wembley, and like he always knew it was my dream to go to an FA Cup final. So I was at 2016 Man United versus Crystal Palace and 2018 Man United versus Chelsea. And when Lingard hit that volley, like we were with the Crystal Palace fans, and there was complete silence, and you could just hear me go, "Oh my!" when he hit it, and then the enormous cheer as it hit the net. Moment I'll never forget.
But that means you got to see the Pardew dance live, right?
I
You saw
didn't see
Pardew
it.
doing the
I
dance
didn't find
on the
out about it
line.
until I didn't find out about it until I got home. It was annoying because he was clearly in my eyesight, but I think I was just standing there like at the volley. I think I would have had a heart attack if I'd seen the dance. Oh.
Brilliant.
I can say it was there, but I didn't see it, as Wenger would say.
So, just to wrap this up, FA Cup favorites, is it even a thing? Is it possible to call the favorite of the FA Cup so early in the season, or is it just madness? Is it just like shooting at the stars?
When I do my Premier League predictions, I do predict who will win all the other competitions, and I do feel like it is written in the stars for Chelsea because for like growing up, they had such a affinity with the FA Cup. They completely dominated it, and I think they've obviously lost the final for the past 2 seasons. I do feel like it will be like there's a very good chance for them to kind of avenge their demons because a lot of the members of their squad won't have experienced the FA Cup glory they previously had. So I feel like they probably have the best chance of lifting it come May.
Right, Chelsea fans with a lot of hope this season. Thank you very much, Philly. If you enjoyed this, you can be back once a month. We can pick other topics to discuss, other topics related to the history of football. But listeners, if you've got any topic that you would like some light to be shed on, please contact us, DM us, slide into our DMs, send us an email, and we will try to listen to your request and make it happen. Philly, anything to say to our listeners?
Yeah, well, thank you for taking time to listen to my guest slot. It's been a pleasure to be on. And yeah, if you like what you heard today, I've got so many more footballing stories that you can find on my channel. Yeah, just search AFC Finners on YouTube. You'll find over 50 stories, and I'm adding weekly. I try to do between 2 or 3 videos a week. We've mostly got football history, but like I said at the start of the video, there's a couple of ground hopping videos I'll be adding on there as well. And if you're a fan of TIFO or HITC7s, I think you'll really like my channel. And yeah, it's been growing really well recently, and every sub is welcome. I'd love to interact with people. I hope you can enjoy my stories. And yeah, I'd love to dive. I love diving through the history of the beautiful game. There'll be plenty more videos to come in the future. I hope to see you on the channel.